This time on Poll Hub, it's back to the states, the battleground states, Nevada, Wisconsin, Minnesota, states that made a difference in 2016. Will they make a difference in 2018? Sure looks like they will. And also, something we've talked about before, the New York Times real-time live super poll thing. We actually talked to the Siena poll, people who are doing it, and there's some news on that. We'll discuss that as well. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
So we have a very busy fall, and it's because, as we've talked about on this podcast repeatedly, this is a historic midterm cycle. There's really never been, at least from what we're seeing right now, there's never been one like this with more intensity, more potential shifting of power. And more enthusiasm. I mean, people are talking about turnout levels that could approach presidential turnout levels. So we are in the states, and we're going to be in the states all the way through until November. The latest ones, Nevada, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Let's start with Nevada because this is kind of an outlier. It's a place where a Republican senator maybe is endangered in a season when it's basically a bunch of Democrats who we thought were endangered.
Yeah, this becomes a very, very important strategic state for both Democrats and Republicans. As you indicate, Jay, this is the only state that's really competitive that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016. But that there's a Republican incumbent. So we're hearing about the Democrats have to pick up a net 2 seats to take control of the majority in the Senate. Well, Nevada is a place they could pick up 1, and it might offset any losses elsewhere. But all things being considered, they almost have to win in Nevada. And look at the numbers, we're seeing that is not a foregone conclusion. In fact, when we looked at our likely voter pool, the Republican Heller is actually up 2 points over the Democrat Jackie Rosen, which means it's, for all intents and purposes, a dead heat.
But editorially, you want to be on the other side.
You always want to be on top of these things. We do see in Nevada this similar kind of enthusiasm that the Democrats are enjoying elsewhere, and even a 7-point advantage over the Republicans in terms of people being very enthusiastic. But I want to talk about it in a second, go into that in a little more depth. Obviously, that's not enough to tip the scales in the favor of the Democratic candidate. In the so-called generic congressional ballot question, the gap between one party and the other in terms of whether people are going to vote for a Democrat or Republican for Congress, the number that gets bandied around. Democrats in Nevada only with a +1. And among likely voters, it's a -1 for the Democrats, meaning there's no real generic congressional advantage for either party in that state as well. So having said that, you then turn to the Senate toss-up, and to have it being 44 for the Republican and 42 for the Democrat makes some sense. And the group that seems to be the one who is not performing to what the Democrats need or overperforming for the Republicans are the Hispanic voters. A critical group. The Democrats are carrying the Hispanic voters, but they're not running up the score. And incidentally, you mentioned the New York Times survey. Our number for Heller, the Republican among Hispanics, is 39% currently. The New York Times survey has it at 38%. So we're seeing a very similar result. Hispanic voters in places like Nevada and Texas and Florida, very different than we might find in New York and New Jersey and other places. This is in fact a diverse group under the label of Hispanic voters, and I think that's what we're seeing there. And we saw some other things. Clearly, the Kavanaugh thing, a voting issue.
Why don't you pause?
Sure.
Not pause there, but I'd like to know your thoughts about how the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings may have impacted this race or these states, because certainly we were polling during that whole controversy.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have had the kind of impact we, hearing elsewhere. I mean, this has been a close race all along, and it remains a close race. the Kavanaugh thing cuts closer in terms of the national numbers. Nevada is closer in terms of people supporting, opposing, voting for someone who supported him, voting for someone who opposed him. The difference is not enormous, and therefore Heller does not get hurt as much in Nevada as he might have, as a Republican might have elsewhere in a state where a vote for Kavanaugh was seen as a bad thing. Similarly, when you look at Donald Trump's approval rating, well, his approval rating is about 40% in Nevada. Well, that's very close to elsewhere. But the disapproval is at 47. So the gap for Trump, well, he's not casting the kind of shadow in Nevada that he's casting elsewhere. And among those who strongly approve and strongly disapprove, there's not a huge difference among them. Usually we're seeing it at 2-1. The strongly disapproves in Nevada are outnumbering the strongly approves, but not, again, to the numbers that the Democrats would want. So all things being equal, the Democrats would feel a lot more comfortable if these were not the numbers in Nevada going into the finals, to the home stretch for the Senate. So that's my take on Nevada.
That's interesting because I see things that I'm looking at Minnesota and I see things that are a little bit different than what you're talking about. And one of the main changes that I think we saw in Minnesota was a change in enthusiasm, particularly among Republicans and independents. 80% of registered voters in Minnesota said that they consider this year's midterms elections to be really, really important. And that was up from 64% that we had in July. Now, everybody went up, but Democrats less so. So Democrats were already energized in July. 80% of them in July told us that they thought that the election was of utmost importance. And now it's 86%. But Republicans went from 64% to 82%,
So
and that's why I was asking you about,
effect.
If you saw any of that in Nevada, because I think that did energize. I mean, granted, it's hard to show causation scientifically because this is a time of the year where you're going to see that kind of attention.
So what's the gap again in enthusiasm now between Democrats and Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, just 4 points.
Okay, so we had 7 in Nevada, so it's again
but that was,
a different situation.
That was 16 points in July. So
Okay.
that's the change that I think we're seeing and hearing about nationally, and Minnesota is a good example of that. And independents as well. Independents went from 55% to 74%, and I think Minnesota is a little different when it comes to independents because I haven't seen those kinds of numbers in other states or even nationally in terms of an energy coming from independent voters. They tend to kind of back off when they see all this kind of political polarization and the intensity on both sides because that's not what they're about. They want compromise. They want a more middle of the road solution.
But Minnesota is a fun place because you get 2 for 1. You have a sale on Senate seats.
I do. Minnesota actually has 3 very important statewide races. Amy Klobuchar, who we got to see during the hearings for Kavanaugh, is the incumbent Democratic farmer labor candidate, which is what the Democrats are called in Minnesota. And she is well on her way to re-election. She has a 60% to Republican Jim Newberger's 32%. Newberger is not particularly well known in the state. I think of half of the voters we spoke with said that they were unsure or didn't really hear about him.
And I think of the hearings, the possible presidential candidate emerged with her performance because she really seemed to be very serious and on top of things.
And it was measured, and it was serious, and it was reflective, and I think. I think that she came out of that kind of a public setting even more positive than she went in, although she's been very popular for some time in Minnesota. But Minnesota also, because of the resignation of Al Franken, because of the recent unpleasantness with him, Tina Smith had been appointed, again, the Democrat, to the Senate, and so there is a special election for the other Senate seat this time around, and she is competing against Republican Karen Housley. And again, in Minnesota, the same thing. The Democrats are doing quite well. Tina Smith has 54% and leads Karen Housley, who has 38% among likely voters that we polled. And the number is pretty similar. Again, it's a 13-point lead, even when we look at registered voters overall. So she has a strong advantage there, and the Democrats have a strong advantage of maintaining those two Senate seats, which they have to.
Sure, these are must-wins for them. What does Trump look like in those two states in terms of?
Before I head there, though,
okay.
we also have a governor's race there because Mark
which I forgot about talking about Nevada, where Lex Alt has a narrow edge among the Republican candidate in Nevada.
Now, is he the grandson of the former senator?
I believe the grandson, I think
former Senator
so.
Paul Laxalt.
Yes, I think
he has a middle
Definitely,
name.
Yes.
He has a middle name to that effect, but I don't know if that was the case.
Yes.
But
definitely in the lineage, he would show up on the 23andMe thing. Is that what it is? Yes, okay,
Yes.
that he would show up on that.
So Mark Dayton, the governor of Minnesota, is not seeking re-election. He served 2 terms. He can serve a 3rd term and has chosen not to. I believe he had some health issues over his term. I don't know if it's that or some of the the intensity of governing. That is also weighing on him, but he decided not to seek re-election. So we have Tim Walz, the Democrat, against Republican Jeff Johnson in that state. And again, Walz has a very strong lead, although he has 51%. Jeff Johnson, who is lesser known and not as popular in the state, has 36. Walz has a very positive rating among residents of Minnesota. He's well liked statewide. So again, that is a very strong likelihood. It's interesting because although Dayton is also a Democrat, he was a Democrat. He was probably the first Democrat governor in a number of decades in Minnesota. So it looks like he may be passing the baton, but of course, we won't know that for another month.
Yeah, and what's interesting, of course, is when we look at a place like Minnesota and other states that we've been looking at in the Midwest, we're seeing a very different picture than we saw in 2016, which is where Donald Trump cracked the blue wall. And I know, Jay, you want to talk a little bit about Wisconsin, which we also have on our Midwest list. So what are we seeing out in the Badger State?
Yeah, I mean, Wisconsin, I think, is actually, more interesting than perhaps Minnesota, in that Wisconsin was a state that had been trending purple. Minnesota has not so much for some time, but it's been trending purple, and then the blue wall was cracked, as you mentioned. So much like Nevada, it's become this kind of purple state where it's a real battleground, and you don't know if a Democrat or Republican is going to win, and it really comes down to, on any given race, statewide race, one or the other could win. It's interesting here because we've been talking about senators. All eyes in Wisconsin are really on the governor's race. Not that there isn't a Senate race that's important, and I'll mention it, but the governor's race, because of who is the governor. The governor is somebody who has been a Republican hero for a long time, Scott Walker, for the variety of reasons of what he did when he came in. He withstood a recall election, and then he won re-election. The state has, in many ways, mirrored the divisions we're seeing across the United States, with very, very evenly split people on one side feeling very strongly supportive of a Republican who has sought to make some significant changes, including municipal unions was one of the biggest changes that he made, where he took away he didn't take away, but the collective bargaining was ended for unions, municipal unions and state worker unions. And this has been something that has driven a wedge down the center of otherwise nice, Wisconsin, and it really is mirrored in what's happened in the U.S. So Scott Walker is right now in our poll 11 points down against a Democrat who nobody was really particularly aware of, but after a very crowded primary, he emerged. And it's an indication, I think, of the intensity of the Democratic voters or the Democrats and independents in Wisconsin. Right now, Scott Walker is at 42%, and Tony Evers, the Democrat, is at 50%. I do want to mention, and I want to get back to this.
Jay, you said 11 points. I'm here with my calculator. Let's see. It's actually 8 points. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's because
8 points.
Evers,
Yeah,
Evers is right
sorry.
at Evers is right at 50%.
Yeah, it's 50 and 42. It's not 11 points. Sorry,
Okay.
I was
Fine.
scrolling down my page to get to that. The point with that race again is that this is a guy who is very, very popular among his base, Scott Walker, and you can see that in the intensity of support, which is really interesting. He's actually got more intensity of support than the Democrat does. So even though he's behind, his supporters are significantly more enthused about him than Tony Evers. So
Yeah, that's a whopping
you know,
number. In fact, we don't see that often. I think is it 80% of his supporters said that they were firmly committed to him, and that's a very, very unusual number. Sometimes we see that for minor party candidates where people have an intensity for that party, so they don't have a lot of supporters, but it's very, very intense. Or sometimes we see it in the primaries, but very unusual to see that in a general election. So that's got to be taken into account.
And I think the wild card here is if you look at non-college educated white women, we'll drill down to one subgroup, a third of them are persuadable. And we've been talking about these persuadables, and Lee, I'm sure we'll be talking about persuadables in a little bit here across all these states. But if you look at these persuadables, the biggest group of persuadables is this group of women. And it's funny because they're seen in many of these other states as the ones who have most turned against Donald Trump. Not that they are against Donald Trump in record numbers, but the biggest switch has come with this group. So it's interesting that they're the ones who are still most persuadable on this. They're still not convinced that Scott Walker's not their guy. Really quickly on the Senate race, Tammy Baldwin, who's the incumbent.
Hang on. Before you move on, I just wanted to get your sense. So do you think you're seeing this 8-point difference between Evers and Walker? Given the other numbers you're talking about, the intensity, this kind of softness among women, and that many may still be undecided, should we count Walker out?
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah, no, and there's two reasons for that. One is the intensity of support that we just talked about at 80%, higher than the guy who's in the lead. And the second is this number of persuadables. I would say the third is that there's another poll that we respect very much, the Marquette University poll, and they have a poll out in the same time frame. They were in this field at the same time, and they have a different result. In fact, they have Scott Walker ahead by a point.
Yes.
So I think that Wisconsin is it was a tough nut to crack in 2016, and I think it's difficult to say what's going to happen there based on who shows up at the polls. I did look deep into kind of the methodology and what they were looking at in the Marquette poll, and interestingly, our results in terms of the number of Democrats and Republicans and independents we talked to as a percentage of this sample is much closer to the historical averages that Marquette University's poll publishes than their own from this poll. Their poll in this case have more Republicans than Democrats by 4 points in the sample, which is a slightly more Republican sample than historically you would see in Wisconsin, and ours is closer to their historical average. So that could explain this difference.
And that's
but they're a good poll, and they do what we do. I mean, random RDD, and they're doing cell phones and landlines, and so it's a good example of how two good polls can reach different conclusions in this snapshot in time. And the explanation is that we simply don't know what voters are going to do because voters get to decide that on election day.
Yeah, and I think the reason we've introduced, as you mentioned, Jay, this concept of persuadable voters is because we want to get introduce the concept of uncertainty, just how big a group is still on the table. And so we take a look at the undecided, which everybody always looks at, but we've also looked at the people who say they might vote differently in a state for one of the candidates. They're not strongly committed like the 80% that we've been talking about for Walker. And we take a look at those, and that shows that there's typically a double-digit number of people who are still making up their minds, and therein may lie the difference between the Marquette numbers and ours as far as Wisconsin is concerned.
The other thing that they did is their likely voter model is different, and this is really important that you guys should talk to us about here. Their likely voter model is people who say, and this is their only criteria, they're definitely going to vote. That's it. Now they show
okay,
results
gotcha.
in
I
this
see what
in
you're
this
saying.
in this particular race. He then showed the results if you model that likely voter thing differently. So if 90% of registered voters show up, if 80% show up, if those who have voted in the past show up, and he did 4 different models, and in some of those, Scott Walker is not ahead. So that may be the likely voter screen may be it too. Talk a little bit about how we do a likely voter model versus them, and why one or the other isn't necessarily valid or invalid. It's a different recipe.
Well, exactly, and it's usually the special sauce of the organization, because there's no agreed upon way of defining likely voters among survey researchers and pollsters in general. So what's helpful is to be transparent, and which the Marquette poll has been, and as we are. What we do is we have actually 3 questions which we ask people about. We ask them whether they have an interest, on a scale, how interested they are in the election, their chance of vote, also on a scale that they have to rate themselves, and then if they've voted in a similar election in the past. And so we combine those numbers so that we have an estimate for each person we speak to about the likelihood we think that they're going to turn out. So we're going to end up with a range of people that are not terribly likely to turn out, to people who say and are pretty convinced that they're going to show up, regardless of what happens. And what we know from our research is that although most of the people who subjectively answer those questions and are very confident that they're going to vote, a small proportion of them actually don't end up voting. And then we also know that the people who we speak with who are at the low end, who say, no, I'm not really interested, I'm probably going to be out of town, or, I haven't voted in the past and I'm not likely to vote this time. We also know some of those people actually do end up voting on election day, or in this case, they can be voting early as well. So we give each person that participates in our poll what we call a probability score. And so everybody's included. There's no cutoff. And what we find is, because people on both ends of the range aren't necessarily perfect, we don't cut them out, and we have a likely voter model which allows for that kind of flexibility in people's intentions.
Therein lies another potential difference in the numbers. You mentioned also briefly the Senate race in Wisconsin. We don't want to ever overlook a Senate race this time.
Because they're all
right.
Gonna count.
This looks an awful lot like Minnesota. Tammy Baldwin is the incumbent there, and she's holding a 54-40 lead over Leah Vukmir. This is a race where the intensity is on Tammy Baldwin's side. So this is kind of flipped from the governor's race, where the guy that's running behind, Scott Walker, actually has more intensity of support. In this case, Tammy Baldwin's intensity of support is significantly higher than the Republican. So this is probably a seat that Democrats are feeling comfortable with, and turning their attention back to Nevada, where the real problems could be for them, because it doesn't look like it would be in Wisconsin, at least not right now. The one race that is going to be a marquee race on Election Day, and everybody's going to be looking at Wisconsin, is the race for Paul Ryan's seat,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is in the southern part of the state. It's what they call the Chilwaukee suburbs, because the people commute from Wisconsin down into Chicago because it's so close. And that district, centered on Janesville, where Paul Ryan is from, that's a race that a lot of people have been looking at a House level. And I think that's going to be the other marquee race that people talk about from Wisconsin on Election Day. And right now, when we look again at the generic ballot or Trump's popularity rating, the kinds of things that might have an impact on that race, things are trending towards the Republicans' favor. They're still behind in terms of the approval, and the president's still behind on the generic, but things over the last poll, or since the last poll we did, have trended in the Republicans' direction. So we'll see. We'll see what happens in that race. But that's the other one I think on election night you're going to be hearing about from Wisconsin.
Yes, and people can tell that we all start getting a little more pace in our voices as we get closer to elections, because that's what we enjoy. We like elections, and we're happy that people are showing enthusiasm. That's a good thing.
You know, we talked a little bit about the Siena poll. In fact, we had their director.
The New York Times
Yes.
live poll. That's the New York Times.
Yep, I should say, yes, the Siena
that they're
Upshot
doing. The
poll that
polls
they're
are doing
It's
live.
the live
Yeah.
poll that you can watch online, and you can watch the polling as it happens. And I think some people found it very interesting, and it's kind of lets folks in, the public in on the secret and what we see on a daily basis of what's happening in our phone room. But we've seen some updates on that too, and as they've moved, I think, to also some statewide races. Did you guys have some thoughts on that?
Well, here's a case where transparency, and I may not like the sentence I'm about to say, but I like the fact they are being transparent. But part of what it is we're getting the score in the races they're looking at after the first inning, the second inning, the third inning, and some of that gets published and can be misleading, and because it's based on very, very tiny samples. So
what are they doing differently, or what do you think has changed from a few weeks ago when this was kind of a novel thing, and people were excited to kind of get an inside look at it?
Well, I think in part when you start talking about Senate races, there are points of comparison with other polls more so than when you're talking about congressional races for the House, because there just aren't a lot of good quality polls that are doing House races. So when they say, candidate A is ahead in some House district, there's not a point of comparison. But in, let's say, Texas, they're showing Cruz up by, I believe, 12 points over Beto O'Rourke, and that is beyond what a lot of polls are showing, although the Quinnipiac poll does have it, I think, up to 7 or 9 points now. But most polls have been showing that as
A more competitive race.
ours, more competitive. They're showing the Blackburn seat in Tennessee, not the seat, but his candidacy, up by 15 points in Tennessee over the former governor who's running as the Democrat, Bredesen. And no one is.
And we had that's Phil Bredesen. We had him up. We had Bredesen up in our last poll.
I mean,
some others
I have some
too.
pretty strong opinions about this, but I want to get you guys into. You have another.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and then interestingly,
and
interestingly, in the Heller race that they did, they had a very similar result to ours, which was 3 points. Nate Cohn from the New York Times has said that House polls, when he's talking about the House, are going to be noisy given the small sample size. And I don't know if I'm comfortable with noisy results now, because we're getting them, because of the transparency, we're getting them as it's occurring, and maybe we're seeing some results that are getting publicized, and they may not be what their final numbers of those states show. That's all, or those congressional districts.
Jay, did you want to jump in with anything before I go on my rant?
So yeah, I'm right. I'm just going to go out on a limb here, and I'm probably going to join you out on this limb. I don't think this serves anybody other than the Times in drawing eyeballs and traffic. And I know that sounds harsh, but when
Are you suggesting this is a gimmick?
that is a word that I would be comfortable using, yes. And very simply, the reason is that when all scientific pollsters talk about transparency, when we talk about trying to be accurate and working really hard to be accurate, and then the difficulties in conveying these things to the media, to reporters, which I was one for 20 years. I was a consumer of polls on that end. I've learned more in the year that I've been, the director of innovation here about polling than I did in the 20 years of having you guys poll for us at NBC. I don't think this helps. It doesn't help the public, and it doesn't help reporters. And I do think at the end of the day, it's a gimmick. Now, the reason I say I'm going out on a limb here is I may eat my words. Every one of their House polls, they may, on election day, see, we told you, and they may get every one of them right. I just find it hard to believe that we're going to get there. And I think all it does is it increases the number of people who go, well, wait a second, you said this person was going to win, or you said that person, or you said the trend was this way or that way, or you predicted this. I mean, getting away from this prediction clock and this 50% chance or 90% chance of winning, I think would be the greatest benefit if we could get away from that after what happened in 2016.
Here's now Barbara Carvalho with her rant.
Well, the thing is, I almost feel, what is old is new again. We dealt with, when doing telephone surveys was really easy, and I'm thinking, back before 2008, when there wasn't as, many issues, with cell phones and all the things we've talked about. There was always the sense of different organizations doing what we called at the time tracking polls. Mm-hmm. And as we got close to an election, the last couple of weeks, these organizations would poll every single night, and they would release the numbers every single morning. And what you did was you kind of saw, the kind of the heart monitor, going up and down, and it suggested that these elections that they were trying to measure or monitor, to continue the analogy, they were very erratic, that voters were erratic, that things
it made the electorate look very volatile when it was the polling methodology that was creating the appearance of the volatility.
And I think with this method that Siena and the Times, as part of Upshot, is doing, is they're creating that same kind of issue. And it's not that we're going to be seeing, of 15 down to 8 or down to 2. It's the problem with the methodology. And science, I've always said, is hard. And part of doing surveys, and the reason why we do them over several evenings, is because we're doing callbacks. We do this over several days. What you get on any one day isn't necessarily a reflection of what the public thinks.
But they are showing just how many people you have to call in order to get your sample. And I think that's sort of an educated
No, there's
point.
Absolutely benefits to it, but I do have an issue with this kind of concept of tracking and taking a pulse every single moment, and so it's we'll see what happens and how well they do in terms of providing a good narrative to these races, which is what I think the goal of doing public polling is.
And I'm just going to point out right now that by way of advertising, that we will be doing a super extravaganza, our program right before the elections, but I'm not going to say any. This is under the heading of
tease. Terrible tease.
This is a tease, but it's going to be something that you haven't seen elsewhere. But for the present, that does it for this program.
Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Did you say a marriage college?
Did I really?
I think you did.
Let's try that again. Marist College.
There you go.
We don't want to start suggesting that more is happening here than just a good education. But I would also like to thank our executive producer, Mary Griffiths, who points us in the right direction and keeps us current. And special help today, Kenny Marples is our editor, but he was filling in on all the buttons and levers and all sorts of things that is at the desk.
I'm going to blame him for any static that I always make. So that was Kenny's fault this time.
And so we'd also like to thank the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, who provides us with the ability to look back at survey questions and results over the decades.
And Jay is going to tell you about how you can learn more about us.
You can send your questions to pollhub at marist.edu. Also, reach out to us on social media. The best way to connect, we're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook, and we answer those questions on this show and directly if they warrant it. And don't forget, look down on the device you're listening to this on, hit the subscribe button, and that way when the next episode comes next week, it will pop up in your queue and you'll be able to listen to it right away. And I just want to say, Lee, that tease right there at the end there, it sounded awful Trumpian to me, boasting about the biggest surprise you'll ever see.
It will be
huge. I don't know, it just struck me as Trumpian.
It will be huge. It will make polling great again.